Welcome to another edition of The Oath and the Office with Professor Corey Brettschneider. I'm John Fugelsang. It's so great to be with you. We have many thoughts. There's a lot to get through today. Let me begin by welcoming the man himself. He is a constitutional law scholar, a political theorist, and the author of one of the most important books on presidential power in the modern era, The Oath and the Office. And if you want to understand how democracy gets distorted by the same people who swear to defend it, there is no better man to talk to. People of Earth joining us now from Finland, where he's been meeting with members of parliament to teach them how to dance. Professor Corey Brettschneider, welcome back.
Thanks so much, John. And, I got this invitation to come to Helsinki and to talk to government officials and academics. And there was an amazing event this morning where I gave a keynote address about threats to democracy at home in the United States and trying to figure out what the hell is going on there, and to also outline hope and to talk about the threat to democracy globally. But I wanted to tell our listeners that one sign that the podcast is growing is I asked the organizers, well, how did you hear about me? And one of the people involved in this conference evidently is a huge fan of the podcast. So I'm in Helsinki because of the Oath in the Office podcast. And what a pleasure that was to hear. And the people in Finland, as we'll talk about towards the end of the episode when we come back to that, are so interested and concerned about what's happening in America, which has, of course, so long presented itself as a beacon of democracy. And yet, as we face a threat to democracy, I think the Finnish people have solidarity with us, with the citizens who are so concerned to protect it. And of course, it will impact the world if our democracy falls. And so they are rooting for us. And part of the hope and energy that I have at the moment comes from seeing the solidarity of the Finnish people who, of course, face their own threat to democracy at the border from Russia and from a dictator that would destroy democracy globally. So thank you to the Finnish people. So glad of those of you who are listening to our podcast, and it's really an honor to be here.
It's really ironic, too, because my parole officer tells me that this podcast is one of the reasons I'm not allowed into Finland now. So I'm glad you get to go over there and pal around with everybody's favorite new NATO allies. Corey, back here in the States, you're missing quite a bit. And for those who don't know, this week, Donald Trump, former host of Celebrity Apprentice on NBC, has deployed the National Guard and the Marines in Los Angeles, which he's called a great decision. Now, friends, you know we're in trouble when Donald Trump says he's made a great decision, because every time he says that, democracy loses a kidney. So they're sending all these troops in to LA to put down a protest on about a 5 square foot block area that is smaller than a magician's convention in Vegas, and 97% of LA wouldn't even know this protest is happening if it wasn't on their TVs. No federal buildings under siege. No cities were burning. And there were fewer arrests at last weekend's protest than there were in one night in 2020 when the Lakers won the NBA championships. And when the Lakers won, they didn't need to call in the National Guard. This was not about safety. It was about optics. It's not a crackdown. This is a mid-season rating stunt. This man is bombing in the polls, Professor. Musk is dragging him on Twitter like a broken Tesla. His tariff plan is about as popular somewhere between Root Canal and Nickelback reunion tour. So he sends troops not to stop violence, but seemingly to start it. Corey, this man was hoping for chaos in a city that protests avocado price hikes, because nothing distracts from a bad week like a fake war in a real city. So I just want to begin by saying this for the people in the back of the militia tent. When a president sends armed troops into U.S. cities to silence criticism, that's not patriotism. That's a purge in camouflage. We are on twice stolen land, stolen from the native people, specifically the Tongva and Chumash, the folks who were there long before palm trees and valet parking. And then in 1850, President Polk, one of our greatest land-hungry Zillow addicts, decided California looked cute and sent Zachary Taylor into Mexican-occupied territory. Don't ask, just invade, because he wanted to take California from the Mexicans for another slave state. And now, 175 years later, Trump is sending troops into that same area and calling those people the invaders. He's out here talking about illegal immigrants, Corey, like he's the bouncer at a club he broke into. This is historical amnesia with a spray tan. This man lost the popular vote twice, impeached twice, indicted more than a mafia family, and he's now using the military to chase immigrants off land that America never legally had to begin with. Corey, this man is like robbing a bank and then calling the cops on the security guard. Where do we begin? The president's asserting
Well,
federal control over California, and it's pretty sloppy in terms of justifications.
Well, John, I think the first place to start is with outrage, and that's why the emotion that you're bringing to this and always bring to it is so appropriate, particularly now. And I just think the point that you're bringing out, which is that these are largely peaceful protests that are trying to be framed as violent. Now, why would he want to do that? It's because he wants to increase the use of the military domestically. It's that he wants to threaten peaceful protest. And, he is here, as much as some of what he's done is precedented, really breaking precedent in trying to use the military domestically in order to quash basic civil rights. There's this long history of using the military in cases in which civil rights were threatened. And that was true during the Eisenhower era, it was true during Kennedy, and it was true during Johnson. And in those instances, when Southern states were really threatening individual civil rights, the military was called out. Now, not often, but in crucial moments. The difference here in this, as I've called it, bizarro moment in which Trump does the opposite of what great presidents have done, he's using the military to quash civil rights, to quash the right to protest. And as you say, he is on dubious ground. And that's so important to talk about because as he risks using the military to really undo civil liberties, undo our democracy, this is the break the glass moment, by the way. We started this podcast because we were worried he would do something like this. And I believe early on I did talk about things like the Insurrection Act, which could enable him to use the military domestically. This isn't hypothetical. It is happening. He is using the military to try to quash not only our civil liberties, not only our free speech, but literally our democracy. And let's get into the questions of justification that you
Yes,
asked.
please, please.
And
Yeah,
I'll just
because I mean, I almost feel like we shouldn't even have this conversation because the answer is no, he can't do it. Like we have to have this conversation, but he does this stuff anyway, Corey, and then he justifies it in the most incoherent of ways. And we have to sit around and talk about his rationale. And by the time the ink's dry on this episode, he'll have changed the rationale. But let please, you mentioned Eisenhower. He used the Insurrection Act to enforce civil rights, and Trump is he's going to use it to suppress them.
Right. So, now here's the problem. And as much as I'd like to say he can't do it, the court will stop it, it's simple answer and don't worry about it. That's not the case. Because unfortunately, what's happening right now, I should say, the rationale is not yet the Insurrection Act. It's a statutory authority that gives him the ability to protect federal officers and buildings. And so in particular, he's using the claims that ICE is under attack to protect his own ICE agents and to protect federal buildings that he also claims are under attack. That's a pretty limited authority. He can't yet use the military to go after protesters. But now here's the problem. There is another deeper power in American history. It goes back to the early 19th century. And that is a law known as the Insurrection Act, the early 19th century. And over time, it has been used in a variety of different instances. It's been used, for instance, by President Grant to protect the civil rights of Black voters attacked by the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups. As I mentioned, it was used during the civil rights era to protect the civil rights of marchers and those who were protected by courts to enforce court orders against local governors that would do the opposite. Now, here's the problem. The Insurrection Act in some instances can be used over the objections of even local officials. And there is a history in these civil rights contexts of doing that. Now, the Insurrection Act doesn't stand above the Constitution of the United States. The First Amendment guarantees a right of free speech, a right of protest, a right to criticize even the President of the United States. So even though he might be right to say there is a presidential power to use the military domestically, this is an exception to the posse comitatus ban on the military, he can't use it to suppress protest. That's the Constitution.
Correct.
It doesn't go away. So that's the danger.
But Corey,
now,
they were waving a Mexican flag. Corey, they were waving Mexican flags, sir. They were waving. They were waving Mexican flags on the streets of America, and that's got to be illegal because that's a foreign country, not like the Confederacy. I mean, the rationales keep changing. I'm sorry to jump in, but the defenses of this, Professor, I don't even understand. I mean,
Right.
we should also point out there's no martial law in play here. The First Amendment still applies, but I
Right.
mean, could a president act like it's martial law, Corey, while cloaking it in legality? Because it feels like that's what we're on the verge of.
Well, I think that's such an important point that you made. And some people have confused the powers of a president under the Insurrection Act to claim that somehow he can declare himself a dictator temporarily, at least under martial law. Just to be clear for listeners, and you already said this, but I want people to really understand this because you might hear things like this. There is no provision that allows for the suspension of constitutional rights, that allows for martial law in the Insurrection Act or any other legislation. The idea of the Insurrection Act is that there is a limited power to use in cases of invasion or insurrection, the ability to, yes, even over the objection of governors, to use the military domestically. And that is an exception to the general ban on the use of the military domestically in the Posse Comitatus Act. But the Insurrection
Hmm.
Act is not more powerful than the United States Constitution. And as I said, in the Constitution, there is this right to free speech, this right to protest. Now, part of what he's trying to do, of course, is to claim that he's not suppressing protests, he's suppressing violence. And my worry is, too, in portraying these Mexican flags that they found in some old B-roll or some small part of protests in LA. I doubt they're from the contemporary moment. Maybe they are, but they certainly are not widespread. But to claim that this is somehow an invasion,
Yeah.
that's the language that Stephen Miller is using. That's the language he's using. So he's going to lie and say it's not about quashing protests. It's about quashing an invasion. And when it goes to court, there is a clear legal answer here, which is you cannot use the military to suppress free speech. I'll go in a little bit more in depth to the Insurrection Act and just mention something, which is that the Brennan Center and myself actually worked during the Biden administration to try to clarify the Insurrection Act, to say
That's
in
right,
the
you did.
law, to amend it, that it can't be used to simply suppress protests, that it has to be used in a limited set of circumstances in which there really is violent instability, and to try to give courts the ability to police that even more clearly. Now, even though the law wasn't amended, all that was trying to do is make clear the structure of our law now, which is that we have a right to protest, we have a First Amendment. And so even though that law should have been amended, could have been amended, it still remains the case that there's a right to protest. And no, we cannot have martial law in the United States. We have a constitution. The court, unfortunately, we're hoping it does its job, but if it refuses to do so, it's going to be on us.
I mean, what specific guardrails did you want to see, and why did Congress fail to act on this?
Well, I think that, and here we have to be honest, that as much as Biden did important things, there wasn't a focus on the structural dangers to democracy that would come from another wannabe dictator, and specifically another Trump presidency. It wasn't that there were no reforms. There was an important reform to the Electoral College that makes clear, for instance, that the vice president can't refuse to certify electoral votes out of any accusations of fraud, to make that role purely ceremonial. That ensures that when J.D. Vance is certifying the votes, that he can't just claim, that somehow that's consistent with the law. He might claim otherwise, that there's a constitutional authority to do so. He might disregard the law, but it at least puts some reform in place. And I would have wanted to see a series of reforms, including reforms to the pardon power, limiting it in the case of co-conspirators or even family members. I wanted to see especially reform to this dangerous power of the president to use the military domestically, the
Yeah.
Insurrection Act, to make clear that it can't be used to suppress free speech. Now, that wasn't done, but again, all that would have done is clarify the structure of the United States Constitution. But we are facing a threat from a president who isn't only threatening to use the military domestically to quash protests, but he said during his ridiculous military parade for his birthday that protesters better not show up. He's just made it
Yeah.
clear that he has no respect for the First Amendment. And so if he starts using this act, and he uses it in the way I predict he will, courts, this is a make or break moment for them. Are they going to stand for the rule of law or not? I expect we'll see at least the lower courts act here, and that's what they're obligated to do under the law.
Yeah, he's also made it clear he has no game whatsoever and doesn't seem to understand there's no scenario where this ends and he looks good. The best part about this whole controversy in Los Angeles ending, Professor, is next week when we're all still talking about the Epstein files and what Elon Musk said. I mean, I don't know about you. I'm not distracted. And by the way, the numbers are brutal on this. Only 25% of Americans think the federal government should even be involved in these protests. 36% approve of what he's doing in LA. Once
Wow.
again, about a third of us. That is not a mandate. That's like a Yelp review of a Cracker Barrel in Van Nuys. But there's an irony here because these same conservative brothers and sisters who scream states' rights all the time, usually when it's trying to defend something overtly racist, but they always scream states' rights, and now they are cheering this federal overreach into California's National Guard. Again, LBJ did this to help civil rights protesters and protect them. Donald Trump's doing this for something very different. What does this tell us about the hypocrisy, or some would say the flexibility of modern federalism?
Well, one thing I'll say is that, of course, you're right that the MAGA base will still be with him. But as you see those numbers dip, talking about his approval in the 30s in regard to this is significant because, as bad as he's acted in the past, his approval usually doesn't dip below 40% or so. So at least we're seeing a crack in that. And some of it might be Americans who did previously support him and then start to realize, wow, you're shutting down the right to free speech. That isn't just like a by the way part of democracy. It's a fundamental part of
Yeah,
democracy. It's the right to criticize our leaders, to make our own decisions about who we're going to be led with. And of course, it is a step towards authoritarian dictatorship. Once you get the military on the streets, this isn't just hyperbole, it is a threat. But I think there is a way of pushing back, and it's Americans resisting that. The other thing that he's doing, in addition to the obvious attempt to shut down the right to dissent, is, as you say, as Americans start to learn what's involved in the Insurrection Act, you have local National Guard being commandeered by the federal government. Now, they're already doing that, as I said, with the limited power to try to protect these federal buildings and ICE, but he's a step away from using it for this next step, the Insurrection Act, granting him more broad power, which he's planning to abuse to shut down protests. That combines two wrongs. One is the wrong of the violation of free speech, and the other is a complete disrespect for the power of local government, of states. Now,
that's
this
it.
isn't the
That's
first
it.
time that we've seen this, and I'm going to just point out one hopeful piece of history. When John Adams tried to shut down the opposition party, there was a question about how to resist. The newspaper editors, as I've talked about, the press, resisted by putting Adams on trial, using their own trials to do so. But two gentlemen, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, had another brilliant idea, and we can learn from it at the moment. They said, how can you get this Sedition Act enforced if local government refuses to do so? They didn't talk about, any kind of violence to the federal government or any kind of attack on it. They talked instead about a kind of passive form of resistance in which states would just refuse to cooperate with the federal government. That's what's triggered this event. The idea of sanctuary cities is in that tradition of saying, if you have federal overreach, we're not going to help you with it. And good luck in enforcing orders to round up undocumented people with no due process, going after innocent mothers and fathers who are gathering at this Home Depot because Stephen Miller has decided that's the way to do it. And this idea of sanctuary cities and sanctuary states is in the tradition of Jefferson and Madison. There's a horrible states' rights tradition, and that's the anti-civil rights tradition, but there's also a proud one, and that's what we're talking about now. So as you see Trump attack not just free speech, but the independent autonomy of states to not cooperate, the National Guard being commanded to violate people's civil liberties, that's a double wrong. And I think that's part of why you're also seeing a slip in the polls. And we've got to emphasize that to people. If you cared about the idea of local government, then you should be appalled by what's happening here.
Well, Corey, you can badmouth Stephen Miller all you want, but when your wife leaves you to join Elon Musk's harem, let's see who you take it out on. Let's see the innocent people you take out your impotent, pathetic, flaccid rage on. And then we'll see you judging Stephen Miller. Okay, we got to take a very quick break, but I have so much more to ask you about this, including the fact that this is costing taxpayers a lot of money, and we need that money for military parades for a president's birthday. Also, I want to ask you a few things about what we can learn from Finland and global democracy democracy and how the other democracies of the world are kind of scratching their heads at what ours is turning into. Quick break. We'll be right back. This is The Oath in the Office. Welcome back to The Oath in the Office. I'm John Fugelsang, joined by Professor Corey Brettschneider. You know, Corey, no one's talking about the cost of this thing. This little temper tantrum in Los Angeles is costing us so far $134 million to deploy 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines for a protest smaller than the last time someone said the word Latinx in West Hollywood. I mean, 134 million we could have spent on housing, education, or even giving every Californian their own legal team to fight ICE in real time. But instead, we have we have military rolling through downtown LA like it's Baghdad with lattes. I mean, if Trump wants to impress us, he could bring a functioning subway to LA. But in the midst of all of this, uh, sanctuary cities have always been a trigger point for Trumpism. And I'm
Mm.
curious, how much is this current deployment linked to that longstanding conflict and that longstanding resentment over immigration and federalism? And I should say over Christianity as well, because this is the point in the show where I got to talk tabernacles and remind everyone that the God of the Torah repeatedly commands us to welcome the stranger and treat them as one of our own. Jesus in Matthew 25 commands individuals and nations to welcome the stranger and says we'll be judged and sent to hell based on whether we welcome the stranger or not. So, I mean, these people, it seems like the only thing they hate more than the New Testament is the Constitution, Corey. But does this pertain at all to the racist resentment towards sanctuary cities, which sanctuary cities, what Christianity was supposed to be?
Yes, absolutely. I will say something about your point about Christianity. J.D. Vance has this narrow idea of localism and that that's really what Catholicism is all about. And of
Yeah,
course, he was rebuked by the Pope at one point saying that's not what it's about. And so your comments there, I think, go to a lot of the heart of the matter of the philosophical narrowness of this administration. On sanctuary cities specifically, let's get into it. It's working. This Jefferson and Madison playbook of saying, come on, John Adams, come get us. How are you going to enforce the Sedition Act if we encourage local government not to cooperate? It turns out the federal government is kind of weak. There is no way, no federal police force, and there was not certainly at the time to enforce it. Now we have ICE. And so there is a way to directly enforce it, and nothing in sanctuary cities prohibits ICE from going in directly to these cities and states and from rounding people up. But I think what Trump is realizing is that as people protest ICE and as local police in sanctuary cities and states refuse to cooperate, it's very, very hard to do. So Trump can't hit his numbers. He wants a mass deportation. Why is that not happening? Because there's actually a limit to the capacity of ICE. By the way, Doge and its crew eliminating the capacities of the federal government didn't help ICE engage in its wrongdoings. And so he's frustrated. And as he's frustrated, what is he going to do? He's going to act like the child that he is and to try to look at a way of slapping down this constitutional way of resistance, this constitutional resistance. How is he doing it? He's calling out the military. But let me say something about this too that connects. Many of the military are members of this community, members of the United States, citizens with consciences. And as they realize that they are going to be called upon to do wrong, to shut down rights,
that's right.
they are not
Yep,
supposed to follow unlawful orders. And they know that. And I think you'll start to see lawful resistance by members of the military. And there is an incompetence already in the way that they're being treated. There were reports about them not being given basic water and food and the kind of chaos of the deployment because the mission
that's
is so
right.
unclear. So, Trump thinks he's got the military behind him, but you can't abuse the military and at the same time think that they're going to back you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Gavin Newsom has tweeted out photos of them having to sleep on kitchen floors without any kind of bedding whatsoever. And the military has access to the Constitution, just like the Federalist Society does. Some of these guys have actually read it. You're right. But Corey, you have said in the past that states are one of our last and best hopes in resisting Trump's
Yes.
authoritarian tendencies or anybody's authoritarian tendencies. I mean, everything these racists pretend the Confederacy was, that the independence of the states. Well, the Confederacy was really about slavery. The Cornerstone speech bears that out. But I mean, what legal and constitutional roles will states still have to push back? Could we see a scenario where governors or mayors resist federal overreach even through legal non-cooperation?
I think we're starting to see it. And as I can't say enough, there's a horrible tradition of states' rights using to resist civil rights. But there also is a proud one. I mentioned Madison and Jefferson using it to defend free speech. And I think this isn't hypothetical. We're seeing it. We see it, first of all, in the laws that have been passed that prohibit cooperation from local cities, including New York and LA, with federal officials. And that is the Madison and Jefferson playbook. I talk in The Oath in the Office about Miguel Marquez and Santa Clara using this technique to resist federal encroachment on civil liberties. And let's just be clear, the purpose of civil liberties isn't just to try to harm the federal government or anything like that. It's out of an understanding that ICE has often rejected due process. And that's just become even more clear in this administration, where they are trying to round people up to send them to a gulag in some instances in El Salvador without due process, where they're claiming that there is falsely, that there is no right to free speech for non-citizens. So that's what these laws are rightly resisting. Now, as we start to see who the leaders are going to be in this opposition to this attempted self-coup, as I keep calling it, the attempt to take over the courts, take over Congress, and now we can add to commandeer illegally local government. It's not a mistake that governors and mayors are starting to step forward. And we've seen that with Gavin Newsom, although he, has had moments that were more mixed, in his interviewing right-wingers, for instance, for his
Oh
podcast.
boy, this is going to really get in the way of him giving pedicures to Nazis. I was going to say, I mean, I hope Gavin Newsom doesn't lose all of his new friends by standing up against fascism.
I think that what's happening is the reason he's rising to the moment. It's not a mistake that it's a governor. It's that he understands his duty to protect civil rights locally as long as the law allows it. And he knows you can't use the military to abuse civil rights. You can't use the Insurrection Act or this other pretense that Trump is using of protecting the buildings, supposedly. And he understands that his obligation as a governor is to protect his citizens' civil liberties. That's embedded in the structure of the Constitution. And I'm going to mention an amendment that liberals are not used to talking about, and that's the 10th Amendment. It says those powers not explicitly given to the federal government are reserved to the states. And that coheres with another amendment, the 9th Amendment, that is very clear that there are many more liberties in our Constitution beyond those enumerated, in addition to those enumerated like free speech. And what that really amounts to, the 9th and 10th Amendment, are crucial amendments for not just liberals, for defenders of democracy of all political stripes against this wannabe authoritarianism, this fascism. What they call for is local resistance in defense of civil liberties against a federal government that's encroaching them. And Newsom is seeing that. He's the new hero of the 10th Amendment, the new hero of the 9th Amendment, the new hero of the First Amendment. And thankfully, he's come around. Yeah, it took him a while, but I welcome him to
Absolutely.
constitutional defense.
Listen, absolutely. And again, I will always make fun of Democrats any chance I get when they've earned it. And that kissy face pedicure he gave to Charlie Kirk, boy howdy. I'm all for public penance. Corey, a judge just rejected earlier on Tuesday Governor Newsom's ask for an immediate order limiting this troop deployment in LA. The judge, U.S. District Judge Charles Breyer, granted the Trump administration's request for more time to respond to Newsom's request. So it wasn't actually turning Newsom down. It was saying, I'm not going to let you do it immediately. I'm going to give the administration a chance to defend itself for this deployment. Did the judge make the right call?
Well, look, you're starting to see the danger that I'm always talking about, which is the law might say one thing, and I have no doubt that Trump is already abusing power and going beyond this claim of trying to just protect the buildings. And I have no doubt that if he uses the Insurrection Act to shut down free speech, that's a violation of the Constitution. And Newsom is using the 10th Amendment, using his constitutional powers to resist fascism. So I'm happy to see that. But I don't want to be naive. It's not like the Constitution has a police force or even judges that are automatically going to defend it. What you'll often get is we need more time. Courts are slow. So ultimately, I do think that there'll be a vindication by courts of Newsom's position. But the example shows us that courts are too slow. Yes, I would have liked to have seen an injunction against an illegal use of the military, and especially with the threats of shutting down free speech, it has a chilling effect that is so dangerous to use the military domestically in this way. But that's just not how courts operate. They're slow. So, I'm always bringing the hope and talking about what the law requires and using the Constitution to defend Newsom and to really highlight his constitutional role. But I don't want to be naive and say, oh, this is illegal. Courts will take care of it. In fact, what that would do is it would pacify people. It would say to them, we don't have to worry. What he's doing is illegal. We're all protected. That's not the moment that we're in.
You're
We're in a
right.
moment in which he's threatening dictatorship, and he might succeed if we're not vigilant.
Yeah, I just want to say out there, he among you who has never deployed the National Guard against U.S. citizens to distract from the richest man on earth calling you a pedophile can cast the first stone. Okay,
Who
but
hasn't done
but
that
but but one
themselves?
line, one line for the stone casting, please. One line. Corey, you're
Who
you're
has?
talk you're talking to us today from Finland, NATO's shiniest new member. Thanks, Putin. And I know you've addressed members of the Finnish Parliament. I'm wondering, Professor, what are you seeing in terms of how small, resilient, functioning democracies are holding the line in this moment?
Well, let me say that I am so impressed, both, first of all, with the amount of knowledge that the Finnish people have and the members of this conference. And I've met with members of the foreign ministry and members of the president's staff, and as well as many academics. And they are really following what's happening in the United States so closely. I spoke to them about my book, The Presidents and the People: Five Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. And we really went into detail about why, as I keep saying, courts are not the end all be all. They also often fail to stop crises of democracy. I talked about how impeachment has never removed a president, but how the American people have repeatedly reclaimed our democracy. And they showed solidarity with that hope. I think they were a little disappointed that we didn't have more fundamental checks on our system, but they're concerned. And so I think that shows a kind of global concern for democracy. And they do have a stable and thriving democracy, famously a brilliant education system that includes civic education. They had a presidency that at one point they thought was too strong, that they backed off by
That's
increasing the
right.
power of parliament. And, I'll say too that there is a thing that creates solidarity here. It's that they see their own threat to democracy at the border from Russia. And that I think what that's done is you don't have here a pro-Putin right wing that you sometimes have in the rest of Europe, and that unfortunately you have even in the United States. Because when Putin is at your door and there is no natural barrier keeping Putin from invading Finland, it's not going to fly in domestic Finland's politics domestically to be pro-Putin. So
Yeah.
that puts a limit, I think, and a kind of solidarity within this democracy and understanding the threat from their next door neighbor.
Well,
And it also
yeah.
highlights the danger of authoritarianism in a way that we need to see even more in the United States. There is no way to be democratic and to, as Trump has said, think Putin is basically a good guy.
No, I mean, they certainly are approaching democratic defense differently than the US. What lessons, though, positive lessons or cautionary lessons, should the rest of us be learning from democracies like Finland as Trump and others challenge the US constitutional order that we've apparently all taken for granted?
One thing that I will say is that, the Finnish education system, being as successful as it is not
Yeah,
disconnected from the robustness of their democracy. The reason why so much is known and why not just government officials and academics, but, cab drivers and people working all sorts of jobs can talk to you here about American politics and know the details, I believe has something to do with how highly educated this population is and how much money and support they give to education. This government, I don't want to be too rosy about it. There are cutbacks to education going on here. This is a somewhat conservative government, but they're starting with a baseline of education that we haven't seen in the United States. We've evaporated our civic education. We have defunded it. And that's why we've become so vulnerable to a wannabe dictator who can act as the salesman fraudster that he is and get away with it. So I think that's one lesson to learn, that there is a robustness to a civil society based in education. I'd also say that in the same way that they realized that maybe there was, that you could have a balance of power and back off presidential power, that's something that we need to do now too. We don't have a parliament, but we have a Congress. And so beginning to think about the recovery from this moment, laws that would allow, for instance, a sitting president and a former president to be indicted by taking
Yes.
the prosecution process outside the hands of that president, thinking about limits on emergency, and of course, to come back to our main theme from today, limiting that Insurrection Act. Those are all ways of bolstering our legislative body, bolstering Congress against presidential power. They've done some of that here, and I think we need to do the same.
Absolutely. What I was really kind of hoping to get out of you was, are any of these Finnish electeds you're talking to expressing concern or horror about what's happening in the U.S.? I mean, what are they saying to you?
You know, I met with advisors to the president, with members of the foreign ministry. And so it wasn't directly meetings with elected officials, but my understanding is that some were in the audience, members of parliament. So hopefully they came away seeing this threat to democracy. But what I learned was a universal, and I should say, too, that the president of Finland is currently in Japan. But what I learned from them is that they care about our democracy and that they see the importance of those of us who are trying to defend it succeeding. Because, by the way, the threat they're facing at the border depends on the American people's robust democracy. If we collapse into dictatorship, there's nothing to keep a dictator Trump from lining up with the Putins of the world, from abandoning not just Ukraine, but Finland. So our fight is the world's fight. And that's got to give us, I think, some sense of solidarity and some desire to continue to fight. The other thing that I did hear, though, I don't want to be too optimistic, is that Donald Trump's media makes it around the world, including to Finland. And so they're seeing the false claims that really
Yeah,
what's going on with the use of the military is an attempt to shut down violence rather than protests. Now, the people I spoke to are well aware of how that lie gets spread. But they, I don't want to be foolish about it, that the threat of authoritarianism is everywhere and that media is spreading. As much as I'm thrilled that there are Finnish citizens listening now to our podcast and podcasts that are calling out the Trump assault on democracy, there are others that are listening to the right-wing sphere of
sure,
influence.
sure.
And so that's why it's so important what we're doing and spreading the message, not just domestically, but throughout the world.
And I'd like to point out I've been to Finland and I was so white, but there I passed for Haitian. So that was good. We got to take one more break. Corey, please stay with us. I have a few more questions about the Constitution under attack and ABC firing journalists for speech that is encouraged on Fox. We'll be right back with The Oath in the Office. Welcome back to The Oath in the Office. I'm John Fugelsang. Corey, Terry Moran worked at ABC for over 25 years, and then he called Stephen Miller hateful, which Stephen Miller's family has said. He is the gerbil Goebbels. And so ABC fired him to appease this administration, I guess. And that's their right. Terry Moran went to work for corporate media, and he probably knew he was taking the risk of getting fired when he made those statements. Of course, if he was at Fox News, and said the exact same things about Elizabeth Warren, he'd likely be promoted. But, Terry Moran worked for a news organization, not Fox. So while I'll be the first to say it's ABC's baby, they have every right to fire him if they want. But the chilling effect this will have on other journalists cannot be overstated. I mean, this is really a victory for authoritarianism over free speech, right when we see these guys at 60 Minutes and these women at 60 Minutes being on the front lines.
And let me just say why this is such an important story, and I'm so glad that we're talking about it. I've talked about why really the true bulwark against authoritarianism in the United States, as we've seen threats from John Adams, who we've talked about, or Buchanan, or Wilson, or any of the presidents who threatened democracy in the past, Nixon, and especially Donald Trump in the current moment, who combines all of those threats. What stopped them repeatedly were journalists risking their freedom in the case of the newspaper editors, sometimes risking their lives in the case of journalists like Ida B. Wells and William Monroe Trotter, who reported on the horrors of lynching and white nationalism and white terror in the early
Mm-hmm.
20th century. They risked their lives to do that. And that is what worked. These people didn't just try to, do a moral thing. It actually prevailed on the American people to reverse course and recover democracy. And so, those members of the media, you and I are talking on Sirius XM every night, and, so many heroes are telling these stories as they should be told, and many of them in corporate media. But when
Yeah.
corporate media stops some of them, when it fires one of the people whose what? Saying the truth, that Stephen Miller, who is, and we should go beyond what was said about him, really just such an offensive individual, a true fascist who is egging on this president to shut down civil liberties. When you tell the truth like that and you're fired for it, I just think that really starts to threaten the institution that's doing the work. I'll say one more thing about Finland, John, which I think you'll like.
Please.
Not to take the, but to go to the question of media. I've been doing media. I did a podcast here, and I also this morning, I think you will especially appreciate this, did a long interview for the main news station in Finland and their main news show, and the network is called MTV. So
Very nice.
and now, they asked me if I had any connection to MTV, and what I remembered is that you had a connection. Is that right?
I
Early
have,
on in your
I
career?
think I probably have a lot of their stationery in my closet at home somewhere in the back. Yes. Yes. I have
But
quite
am
a,
I right? I don't think we've ever talked about this, and I'm sure our listeners don't know this. But were you one of the first VJs for MTV for
no, I
VH?
was not one of the first VJs. I
Oh.
was a little kid when it started, but I was a VJ for VH1 in the 90s, which is part of the MTV network salt mine. So yes, I did my time in the Viacom gulag. Absolutely. I can introduce Hootie and the Blowfish in 7 different languages, but very different MTV than the kind you're talking to.
You were after Kurt Loder, the next generation. But I was so glad to be able to point out to this journalist that in fact there was a connection between my talking to MTV and our great podcast.
Yes. I would, but I was
So
at
I got it
VH1
right.
when,
I was fact checking myself.
and that I was a young comedian, but I talked a lot about music. So they hired me to come talk about music, and that sort of was my broadcasting grad school. It's where I learned to read prompter and do television. But again, that was when VH1 was still a music channel, not a washed up celebrities sitting in a hot tub channel. So Corey, I want to bring it back to what's going on here, because Finland sounds wonderful, and I don't want to think about that. You've spent your entire career, Professor, studying how presidents warp or protect the Constitution. Your excellent most recent book, The Presidents and the People, is all about this. So how would you describe what this White House, what these Republicans are doing right now in this moment? I almost don't want to say Trump anymore because it's not just him. He's the figurehead of a larger movement. Is this authoritarian drift, or is it something more deliberate?
Well, I think it is an attempt to destroy democracy. That, one of the mistakes is to not take him at his word when he says, I'm not going to allow protests at my military parade, or when he is calling out the military in one part of his mouth, saying that it's all about protecting federal buildings and ICE. And what we really know is that this is about quashing protests. And as
Yeah.
protests rightly start to pop up around the country, get ready. He is going to try to use the military to stop us from speaking out. We're not going to stop. But, part of the idea of turning to history in this book is to give hope. And the way that you get hope is that you see how bad it was in the past. You see these moments. And I just want to remember to remind listeners that John Adams did shut down the opposition party. He passed the Sedition Act. He passed what Trump is now reviving, the Enemy Aliens Act, depriving due process for non-citizens, something that was illegal then and is illegal now. And although the Sedition Act expired eventually and we fought back, at the moment it looked so dire. There was concerns also, by the way, about him building a military to shut down, and he might have done so if he would have succeeded in stealing the election in 1800 as he tried, John Adams. And from that moment, it was frightening. The leader of the opposition party, and just to show you how bad it was Thomas Jefferson, the vice president of the United States, and the president of the Senate had to be quiet as a plot to steal the election of 1800 was discussed on the Senate floor because he was worried he would be prosecuted. Now, we're in some ways in a similar moment. We're also facing a threat to democracy. There isn't a Sedition Act. There isn't the shutdown of the opposition party. So I think we can take, comfort if we survive that, if the editors the journalists who so bravely use their own trials to use the election of 1800 as a referendum on democracy and elect a president, Jefferson, that same vice president who was afraid to speak out, was able to say in his first inaugural, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. And that wasn't just a nice line. It was a way of saying we are not going to have a law allowing the shutdown of the opposition party. If we survive that, we will survive this. It's not as bad as it was then. And I think that we have the resilience and we have the past victories to have victories this time.
So speaking of those past victories, Rumyeza Ozturk, picked up the tough student who co-wrote an op-ed for her school newspaper and was handcuffed on the streets. And she's been released by judge's order. We've seen these law firms that capitulated to Trump losing clients, and people are letting these law firms know the market is deciding, and it's going to continue to decide. And of course, we haven't even mentioned it, Corey, but in our final moments, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is being returned
Right.
to the U.S. And Pam Bondi is now going to charge him for all these incredible crimes they never thought to charge him with before, because she
Right.
needs to save face and try to demonize this man. And she's praying that he's somehow sinister and evil. But I think the conventional wisdom of most people who are demanding that he be returned to the States is not unlike it was 10 years ago when Barack Obama brought Bo Bergdahl back after deserting in Iraq. The fact is, bring them home and put them on trial or a court
Right.
martial. I mean, that's it. Just do the due process. I don't,
Right.
if Kilmar Abrego Garcia is guilty of human trafficking, I think it's more like he was an Uber driver driving people around, and they're really going to stretch on this. But everyone I've spoken to says no. Bring him back, and if he's
Right.
guilty, then deport him again. But just you have to follow the law, America. Bring him back home. And so I agree with you. It's working. It doesn't feel like it all the time, but this resistance, especially on the judicial level, is really showing results.
It is a victory in the Garcia case, and I can't emphasize that enough. What the administration was claiming was that the Enemy Aliens Act, which remains on the books, that's why I talk so much about John Adams. That's the history of where this law comes from, an attempt to shut down really the rights of the opposition altogether. They claim that that means they don't even have to go to court. And that's why they defied a court order telling them to bring the planes back from the gulag in El Salvador, sending Venezuelans there. So by acknowledging that he has to come back to stand trial, what they're doing is saying, okay, we see that the courts are not allowing us to just ignore due process. Now, the whole point of due process isn't that nobody goes to prison. It's that if somebody's committed a crime, the government has to show the evidence. It has to put somebody on trial. So if they've got evidence that he committed a crime, fine. I'm skeptical. I think that they're making it up. And you know
Yeah,
what? We have courts of law to determine this. So my railing against the deportation of Garcia to a gulag in El Salvador was never about some claim that he was definitely innocent. I don't know.
correct.
It was about
Correct.
showing the evidence. By the way,
Yes.
Mike Zamor, who's thankfully coming back to join us very soon, and I'll advertise the date soon, the policy director of the ACLU, who are leading so many of these cases, including this case that we're talking about, the Garcia case. His whole point was, we don't know who's on those planes. We don't know if they're Venezuelan or citizens or
Correct.
non-citizens. That's what due process does. So this is a victory. Even if it turns out that he's guilty, that's not the question. It's subjecting him to legal processes.
Amen. Professor, I want to thank you so much for giving up your time in Finland. I'd be out partying all night with the Finns, and you're still so committed to the pod. Corey, I want to tell everybody out there to please, please, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, give us a review, tell your friends, share this show on the socials. And what's the best way, Professor, for our listeners to follow you and all your other work?
You could buy a copy of The Presidents and the People, Five Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It, at your local bookstore or on the Amazon or anywhere that books are sold. And I just want to emphasize too, I mean, to be able to travel, halfway around the world and to talk to people who are showing solidarity with our struggle for democracy, from this very functional democracy, Finland. That's made possible by the fact that people are sharing this podcast around. They wouldn't have heard of me, I think, if it wasn't for the fact that you and I, John, are talking every week. So keep doing it. Don't just review us, which I hope you will. And we have some amazing reviews. I'll continue to read them. Send us your questions to corey.brettschneider@gmail.com. And most importantly, spread it around. Email people, send text messages. That's what's allowing us to grow. I should say, John, that we are growing. Each episode gets better and better. Guests, no guests, it just grows and grows and grows. And we've been consistently top 10 in the government category on Amazon, and even our episodes are just climbing to the very top of the charts
Amen.
every week. And so thanks to our listeners. You really have made this a pleasure. The whole reason I'm in Finland is because of this podcast. So of course I was going to interrupt the trip to do the podcast.
Well, hey, Corey, that's all thanks to our listeners and all thanks to you because you got the Riz, Professor. Thank you so much. I want to thank Wendy and everybody for helping us put the podcast together. I'm John Fugelsang. Please keep it tuned here. We'll be back next week with another edition of The Oath and the Office. And I want to remind you, Elon says that Trump is in the Epstein files. Trump says that Elon's a junkie. And the Republicans are like, guys, could this at least wait until after we gut Medicaid? You got a lot of America waiting for you to come back, Professor. I'm John Fugelsang. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on The Oath in the Office.